Bannacht. On the day when the weight deadens on your shoulders and you stumble, may the clay dance to balance you. And when your eyes freeze behind the grey window and the ghost of loss gets into you, may a flock of colours, indigo, red, green, and azure blue, come to awaken in you a meadow of delight. When the canvas frays in the currach of thought and a stain of ocean blackens beneath you, there may come across the waters a path of yellow moonlight to bring you safely home. May the nourishment of the earth be yours, may the clarity of light be yours, may the fluency of the ocean be yours, and may the protection of the ancestors be yours. And so may a slow wind work these words of love around you, an invisible cloak to mind your life.
So now I'm just going to tell you that Saint Brigid and Brigid, the goddess before her, was all about nourishment and hope and seeds and new life coming up. And because of that, we thought that maybe we'd do something about the silver linings of the COVID cloud. So if you have any silver linings, if you could put them into our chat, that would be great. And maybe we'll be picking out one or two of them as we go along. One of the biggest COVID cloud silver linings for me has been my growing family of storytellers. And it is in cyberspace that I met the wonderful Shona Cowie and Kama Roberts, and we've become great friends. And in fact, Davóg Rynne, who brought us in with the prayer of peace earlier, I also met him in cyberspace. So one of the big silver linings for us are the friends that you can make in new land with no borders. And so I'm now going to Cyber Scotland. We're going to fly across the Irish Sea to Shona Cowie, and she's going to tell us about Brigid and what it means to them in Scotland. So Shona, you're unmuted. I'm looking forward to seeing you spotlighted. There you are. And off you go.
Thank you. That was a lovely introduction, an amazing, beautiful song from Claire. We're just going to carry on in that vein. And I'm going to tell you about how I call her Brigid. As she goes walking, she brings the clothes of winter, and all the trees and meadows become so green and gay, and the birds, they are calling the long days of summer. They fall behind our Bridie, the one that they adore. Bridie, they say, was born as the sun rose, and she was lifted into the sky on a sun's ray. They say that sunbeams emanate from her skin. She is the goddess of everything that goes up, of high thinking and high flames in the highlands. She is everything you imagine, a total babe. She has got long, luscious locks and fresh skin, a little bit flushed, full of life. And she wears a mantle, a green cloak. Now, if you are fortunate enough, you have a green cloak or a green scarf, something that you can wrap around yourself. And tonight, in Bulk, her night, you can leave it outside your door, and she might bless it as she passes. And then in the morning, you wrap it around yourself while you're having your coffee or brushing your teeth, and you'll take in the blessing that she gave you. And every time you use your green cloth, it gets stronger and the blessing builds. Very important. When she gets home, she hangs her green mantle on a coat hook, made from a sunbeam. And if one of us was to look inside her threshold, across her doorway when it opened, we'd be blinded. Her house is as bright as the sun. In Scotland, in the olden days, Inbolk today was a women's day and a girl's day. We would get dressed in whites and we'd put flowers or twigs and ribbons in our hair, and we would bake bread and we'd share it among the community. And the men were banished for the day and they could not come back until they were given permission to cross the threshold after all the women had eaten. Now, Brigid, she has a counterpart. There's so many stories about her. There's so many. She has so many names and so many positions, but she always has a counterpart. She is the goddess of spring and summer, and the Cailleach is the goddess of the autumn and winter. And in so many of the stories, they're seen as enemies. They're seen as two sides, conflict and fighting with each other. In Scotland, they say that it's one person with two faces, the beautiful young Brigid and the ugly crone of a Cailleach with a hunched back, hard and brutal like the winter. That's why they both wear hoods to hide the back of their head. But I don't buy it. I don't think that these two women are ever in conflict. And it annoys me that so many of our stories suggests that they would be. I think they know each other very well. I think they love each other and they recognize and support each other. And they recognize when one is tired and needs to step back, and so the other comes forward. Saying that, I am pretty glad that this winter is at an end. Thank you, Cailleach. You can have a nice rest now. I will be skipping upwards with Brigid into the spring. And I hope you will too. Back to you, Maria. You're on mute.
Thank you for that. I was just saying, Shona, how many beautiful things that we share in terms of our shared Celtic history. And we talked about this when we were preparing. So it was lovely to hear about her green cloak. And Shona, I have to tell you, my sister Helen put out her cloak last night on the line. And when she came down to collect it this morning, to put it over her shoulders and to have her first cup of Barry's tea of the day, she noticed that the birds had left a present on it. So she didn't wear it. You're joking now. Thank you so much to Shona for that. And I'm going to release you from the spotlight now, Shona. And I'm going to ask Nuala Hayes to get ready. So I've been looking at the beautiful silver linings of the COVID cloud that everybody is putting into the chat. Thank you so much. A lot of them are about how we get together in sessions online and how we've made friends and the nourishment of music and how we can get people together in cyber worlds that would never come under the one roof in real life. What is real life anymore? But another nourishment of the COVID cloud, and a lot of you mentioned this as well, were the new skills of baking bread. I saw Ray put down how she's developed her cartooning skills, absolutely amazing. And Ray in her own right is a very good storyteller as well. And so the nourishments are still pouring in, which is great. Keep them coming. And meantime, we're going to have a word now from the chairperson of the Storytellers of Ireland, and her CV so long that I couldn't tell you about it. So I'm going to get her to introduce herself, the wonderful, warm, talented Nuala Hayes. So Nuala, are you there? If you could unmute yourself, that would be absolutely excellent.
Here I am.
Oh, there you are, Nuala.
There I am. Well, Gormagat Maria and Dave, Fáilte Gohéran, friends from Alban and Bratton Yog and everywhere else. It's lovely to be here. What a lovely idea to gather our cousins together. I'm going to give you, first of all, my credentials as a follower of Brigid. My mother was Brigid, Now, a little bit like the Scots, she was from Cork and they called her Bridie McCarthy. But when she came up here to Dublin and married my father decided that Breathe was a much nicer, more dignified name. So my mother, as far as I was concerned, was Breathe. My mother-in-law, the mother of my gorgeous husband, Art, was Brigid, which means little Breed. And she and my mother, they both lived to the great age of 96 or 97. They were indomitable women. And on top of that, my son, Oisín, married Roisin, and her mother is called Brida. Now, Brida is still alive, and I tell you, she's very much alive. She lives down in County Wexford, and there's no stopping her. And then to top it all, my granddaughter, Siofra, her second name is Breed, Siofra Breed. Now, she's 18 now, and she's just at that stage. She's not too keen on the Breed name, but she did send me a message to say today and to give me good wishes for La Éile Breide. So you'll gather that Breed or Bridie or Brigid are very popular names in Ireland. And our Breed is actually a very rooted woman. I know she was the saint, and I know she has lineage way back in the distant time as a goddess. But we actually, and in folklore, she's a kind of a very practical woman also, as well as being an abbess of Kildare. But a little known fact, well, maybe you all know it, but a little known fact about Breed was her interest and her liking for beer. And there is a poem from the 10th century. Now, our Breed would have died in the 6th century, but in the 10th century, there's an old poem which was loosely translated by Kerry's own Brendan Kennelly. So I'd like to give you that poem now, just to tell you I know Breed was kind of given, our bride was given a lot of kind of the qualities of magic and power. And she was Christianized, and a lot of the people telling her story wanted to compare her to Christ, maybe Jesus Christ. And we know the story of Jesus turning water into wine. Well, Breed, apparently, once upon a time, she worked with lepers. Leprosy was very common in the old days. And she worked with lepers. And the poor lepers, they were dying of thirst, not for water. They were dying for beer. And apparently, Breed didn't have any beer at the time, but they said she had baths. And she was able, through the power of her belief, change the water in the baths into beer. And those who questioned these stories discovered that, well, actually, being a monastic woman, she would have had hops or the makings of beer in a bath as before the milling of it, and or before the making of the beer. So it was likely that there was an element of truth in it. But anyway, here is the poem from Saint Brigid from the 10th century. Here she goes. I'd like to give a lake of beer to God. I'd love the heavenly host to be tippling there for all eternity. I'd love the men of heaven to live with me, to dance and sing. If they wanted, I'd give them vats of suffering. White cups of love I'd give them with a heart and a half. Sweet pitchers of mercy I'd offer to every man. I'd like the people of heaven to gather from all the parishes around. I'd give a special welcome to the women, the 3 Marys of great renown. I'd sit with the men, the women, and God there by the lake of beer. We'd be drinking good health forever, and every drop would be a prayer. Amen.
Amen.
And that, so that's the poem, loosely translated by your own Brendan Kennelly. But I'd also like to tell you just some of the stories from the Irish tradition about who Brigid was and where she came from. And as you know, in Ireland, everybody wants to know the background. Like, who are you and where do you come from and who are your parents? But this is a little bit about the lineage of Brigid. Now, they say that Brigid's mother was a woman called Brigid, and she was a slave woman in the house of Davóg, who was a powerful man who lived in Leinster. Now, it wasn't unusual for powerful men to have a bit of a relationship on the side with the women who worked for them. Things haven't changed that much maybe, but as it happened, Davóg's wife, who normally would know about these things, she realized that her husband was very fond of this particular woman, Brigid. And she said to him, I don't want her in the house. Get rid of her, take her away. So he didn't want to cross his wife. The women that at that time had a fair bit of power. He didn't want to cross her. So he agreed that he would take Brigid away and maybe do a deal with somebody else for her. She was a slave after all. So he put her into the carriage. She was large with pregnancy. She was about, I'd say she was about 3 or 4 months gone at this stage. And off they went on the carriage. Now, as they were driving along, this would have been a fine carriage now, and you could hear the wheels along the gravel road. And they say there was a druid inside his house, and he heard the sound of the wheels and went out to see who it was passing by. And when he saw the carriage, he stopped it. And he said to Davóg, he looked at the woman beside him and said, well, who is that woman? And Davóg said, that's Brigid. She's a servant of mine, and she's carrying my baby, and my wife wants me to get rid of her. And the druid looked at Brigid, and he said, your wife's children will be servants to this servant's child, because the daughter in her womb is wonderful and marvelous and shines like the sun among the stars. When Davóg heard this, he changed his mind and he turned around and brought her back home again. So she stayed at home with the family for a while, and she got bigger and bigger and bigger. And the wife's jealousy grew like a cancer. It got bigger and bigger and bigger too, until eventually, knowing the child was soon going to be born, she said, I'm not putting up with this anymore. Take her away, sell her this time. So Davóg had to do what he was told, went off, took her away in the chariot again. And this time he did sell her to another druid. He thought she'd be well looked after there. But he said to the druid, the woman is a slave, but the child, when she's born, she will be a free woman because she's my daughter. So it happened. Times were good for women and tough for women at the same time. Brigid was put to work again. She had to earn her keep. Where did we hear that before? Anyway, she was earning her keep, and they say she was carrying milk in a pail. She was sent out to milk the cows, and she was carrying the milk in a bucket. And she was just going from outside inside, and on the threshold of the door, she suddenly felt the pains. And they say she gave birth there with one foot inside and the other foot outside the house. The baby was born and washed in the milk from the pail and given the name Brigid, which means fiery arrow. So her destiny was there. She lived for a while. She grew up in the druid's house, and apparently she was a grand girl altogether, enthusiastic about everything, helped with everything, looked after the animals, looked after the people. She was a great little one, as they'd say here. And anyway, she grew up, and like a lot of children, after a while, they want to know, she knew who her mother was, but where was her father? She wanted to know who her father was. So remembering the druid kept his promise. He was told that the child would not be a slave. So eventually it was arranged that she go back to her father's house. And so she arrived back to the father's house now, a young woman. We don't know what the wife thought about that, but she was welcomed enough. She was the daughter, the legitimate daughter of the house. And in she came, and she was given jobs. She was given the job. Women are given this kind of job to look after the house, to look after everything. And it wasn't long before her brothers in the house and the mother were getting a bit annoyed by her because she shared everything they had in the house. The family would be fed, and anybody who came to the back door, all the traveling people, all the workers, they were all fed with the food from the house. She made no difference between inside the house and outside the house. Everybody was given food, and they were getting sick of that. What are we going to do with this one? She'll eat us. She'll have us empty. She's having us eaten out of house and home, they'd say. What we're going to have to do, we're going to marry her off. So they decided they'd look for a good man to marry her, take her off their hands. And a local man was given the word. They tried to make a match with him, and he thought it'd be great to marry into this rich house and get a fine wife. But Brigid wouldn't look at him. He got to be fed up, and he started to jeer at her. He said, "That lovely eye in your head would be lovelier if it was looking across the pillow at a husband." Well, Brigid said, if that's the case, she turned around, she put her finger in her eye, and she pulled it out. He won't marry a blind woman. And sure enough, when he saw he was going to be married to a woman with only one eye, he changed his mind. So they decided they'd let her go. No, they wouldn't let her go. The wife comes in again, and he says, take her away, get rid of her, sell her, do anything with her, get rid of her. So he put her in the chariot again and took her off to the king. He wanted to tell the king of Leinster what he had to put up with. And he went inside to talk to the king, left her outside in the chariot. And while they were having the conversation inside, a beggar man comes up, and he asks her for a few bob, alms, anything she had. And there was nothing left in the chariot except her father's sword, her father's gilt-edged sword, and she handed it to him. The father came out, and when he saw that she had given his sword, his one good sword, away, he was furious, and he said to the king, look what I have to put up with. What are you going to do? And the king said, if you'd give your father's sword away, what would you do if I brought you into my house? And Brigid said, if I had your wealth and your power and your money, I'd give it all away because it means nothing to me. So they all decided they'd wash their hands out of her, and they let her off to do her will. And that's why we have all the stories of Brigid the abbess, Brigid the saint, and Brigid the woman who created so many stories all over Ireland. And I'm sure Maria Gillen can tell you some of them. So thank you for listening to me.
Always unmute myself. I mute myself because I'm a devil for reacting to the stories, and there was plenty of reaction there, I can tell you, Nuala. You know, so I really enjoyed the new bits of Brigid that I learned. Like the threshold makes sense to me now. The green scarf on the threshold was because the threshold was a very important part of Brigid's story. So thank you for that, Nuala. You know, really appreciate it. And now we're going to go back to the COVID clouds. I'm going to release Nuala from the spotlight, and I'm going to come back to the silver linings of the COVID cloud. Just like Brigid, who could see good in everything, people here are talking about nature and what it has come to mean to them, and the slowing of the paces. And I particularly liked in the chat the one that said, I was given a cob horse, and during this time I got to know him and he got to know me. Isn't that just beautiful? So the pace of life seems to be changing under the COVID cloud, and not all of it is for the bad. Some of that is quite nurturing, nourishing, and nature filled. So thank you for that silver lining of the COVID cloud, and please keep them coming. They're really rising my spirit. Now, with the red thread of story, I thought I would tell the traditional Breed tale. It was going to be in the second half, but we're going to move things around because where Nuala stopped, my story begins. Breed had been released from the houses of the men that had held her, and she found freedom terrifying. But she met some friends along the way, 3 in particular, and then one more, and the 5 moved across the fields as if the world belonged to them, sleeping under hedges, getting what they were given to eat, just as they had given what they had to people before. And it seemed to them to be a life of great riches, a life they weren't born into, for sure. And sure, aren't we all feeling the life that we weren't born into right now? Well, Breed, she thought again of the King of Leinster and all his wealth and all his mouldering riches down in dark dungeons being hoarded for those that would come after. And she knocked on his door. And he saw her from the window and he thought, oh no, here comes the woman that gives everything away. And he said, send her round to the back of the house and tell her she can have 2 days' work in the kitchen. And during those 2 days, she was in charge of the meat pot. She had such a light hand with food, and it seemed that she could make it as tender as it could possibly be, and she could make a little go a long way. And she was making the 3-day stew with the big fat bone inside in the pot, and when it had just burst open and released its marrow, she added the tender lamb pieces. 'Twas as if he smelt it. An old man came up to the back door, the eyes shining blue deep in his head, so intelligent and wise and attractive, those eyes. And he said to her, anything, anything for an old soul. And she gave him a heaped up dinner, just like the king himself would have, and he enjoyed it entirely. But then she realised there was no meat left in the pot, and she thought, there won't be 2 days' work here, nor anything else, nor will I be able to ask him the question that keeps coming to me in my dreams to ask this man. The visitor got up and left the table with a buchas le dia, a thanks be to God, and he was gone. The king came down, and Brigid shook in her shoes, but said nothing, for she had learnt the art of silence. And the king lifted the lid and said, "Ho! By some miracle, you've left meat in here, and not just a little bit of meat, but lots and lots of it. I had heard tell that you'd given it away." Brigid tried not to let the shock show on her face, and the king ate well out of that pot for a whole week. "I have a question for you," she said. "What kind of question?" said the king. "I'd like a piece of land to continue my work," she said. "A piece of land so that I would be able to give people what they needed and that they could bring their worries to me." "A piece of land," he said. Brigid was known for wearing the blue cloak, the one bit of luxury that she had. She took the blue cloak off now and she said, "As much land as my cloak will cover." "Is that right?" said the king. "Well, that won't cover much. A small little woman with her small little cloak." And then she went down to the field below the castle. She asked her 4 friends to take a corner each and to start walking. One walked north, one walked south, one walked east, one walked west. And they kept walking and praying and walking and praying, and the pious cloth that took the prayers stretched on and on. And the king said, "Stop, stop, for God's sake, for you'll cover the whole of Ireland. Take that space near the river to build your church and leave me alone." And to this day, in the county of Kildare, you can see St. Brigid's church that she got with her pious blue cloaka. And outside of that church, there's the unjumpable hedge. But that's another story for next year. So you'll have to come back. And that's the end of my St. Bridget's Day story. Oh, thank you, Aster. That's a lovely clap. And Kama and Claire. So I'm just looking now at the beautiful COVID cloud linings. And there's one here saying the fine images that are woven on our inner eye by the stories. Isn't that lovely? And another one says how we can fly across lands under the cyber ceiling. Absolutely, I completely agree with that, you know. So we also, somebody here has mentioned Liz Weir. Liz Weir has been an amazing teacher and guide through COVID. She has given us story workshops. She has been generous with her own stories, and she has a session every week up in Ballyeamon Barn in the wilds of Antrim. And because of the technology that we've all gotten so familiar with, we can now land in as well. I see many of her people here, and I see that they're going to offer us stories in the second half. So I'm really looking forward to that. And I'm looking forward to the Rambling House taking off very soon, and the mixing of the waters. So we'll have stories from the north, stories from the east, stories from the west and the south, just like the Cloak of Brigid. What a great note to end the first part. This is where we give you all a comfort break. Davóg Rynne is going to play his music in the background now. I have a little recording from Davóg, and he may be here live when we have our open mic. And then in the next part, we're going to continue with the formal session, and we're going to have another story, one each, from Scotland, Wales, and from Ireland, a beautiful song from Claire Fennell. Then we'll finish the formal part. We'll have another comfort break, and we'll start the Hoolie and a Half, the Rambling House part that Kerry is famed for. So that'll be our third offering. So right now, I'm going to share my screen and bring Davóg on. Go and get a cup of something warm, something beautiful, a cloak to put around you and keep you cozy, a hot water bottle if it's cold where you are, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
So this starts with Brigid, and she is to marry this man, and she doesn't want to, as we've heard. It's winter, and the moon is bright and full, and she's lying in her bed. I can't, I shan't, I won't, she thinks. She finds herself climbing out of bed, climbing up onto the windowsill and dropping down onto the soft earth outside her house. But almost as soon as her feet touch the earth, she hears the cry of servants. "Brigid, what are you doing? Get back in your bed. Tomorrow is your wedding day." Her heart leaps into her mouth. She finds herself running down the path and out onto a common. She runs and runs and runs and runs and runs as fast as her legs can carry her. It doesn't take long before she hears the sound of horses' hooves behind her. 1, 2, 3, 8 sets of horses' hooves, and they're galloping behind her. It's her father and 7 of his best men. "Come back!" But she doesn't come back. She keeps on running. And these are horses running behind her, and she's only got legs. But she keeps on running. And somehow the wind, it must pick up her feet and carry her from that place, because they can't catch up with her. And she runs and she runs and she runs. And finally, she finds herself unable to run any further. She's standing on the edge of a cliff, high up on a cliff, the sea angry below her. She's just about to give up, go back. accept this marriage, when suddenly below her, the ground, it begins to wobble and shake and creak and crack, and then suddenly the soil beneath her just collapses and she plummets down, 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 down and into the sea. She can hear her father shrieking behind her. They make their way down to the ocean. They search and they search and they search, but they can't find her. Gone, dead. The next day, which should have been their celebration of their marriage, turns out to be a day of grieving. But Brigid, she wasn't dead. It was like magic had carried her down on that lump of turf. And she found herself landing light as a feather on the top of the ocean. And she found herself drifting through that ocean all through the night. And then the next day, she's still drifting. She can't believe it. And she's drifting and she's drifting and she's drifting. She carries on drifting, days turning into nights, nights turning into days, days turning into nights. 7 phases of the moon go by, and by now this lump of turf is beginning to dissolve. It's just a little patch. She's sure she's just going to drown in the water, but she can't. She shan't. She won't. With a great shriek, she leaps up into the air and she transforms immediately into a salmon, a great, strong salmon, glistening in the winter sunshine, and she dives down into the water. And she flies through that water, leaping and bounding, bounding and leaping. One day the sun comes up. This sun is different. It's not the cold winter sunshine, it's spring sunshine, it's warm. And in front of her, there's a land, a great green land. It's beautiful. And she feels she's drawn to it. And as she comes nearer, she feels her scales beginning to drift away from her. They dance over the water like 1,000 stars. Her fins fall away and she rises up out of the water. And as she does, she hears laughter. She hears laughter coming galloping down that hill. It's a river sprite. Hello, says a river sprite. My name is Ystwyth. Who are you? My name, she said, is Brigid. She said, I'm going on an adventure, said Ystwyth. Will you come with me? No, she said, I'm drawn to this place. I feel the people of Wales need my kindness. I won't come with you. But in the way that Irish people do, she wanted to know everything about this water sprite. She wanted to know who her mother was, her father, where she'd come from. I would love to tell you, said Ystwyth. And so she did. And this is a story that she told. This story is so old, it almost touches the beginning of time. It begins right in the middle of Wales, right in the centre of the Cambrian Mountains. In fact, it starts right in the centre of the heart of the great mountain, Plynlimmon himself. And on this morning, he's sitting out on that mountain and he's working. He's working where he's worked for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. He's working with an enchanted needle and he's sewing. He's sewing the dust into sand, the sand into rocks, and the rocks into mountains. He sits back and he marvels at what he's done. I mean, it's incredible. Dry, dusty mountains and deserts that stretch on and on and on and on and on as far as the eye can see. He should be pleased. He should be delighted with what he's created. But all he feels is thirst. Thirst and a great, great loneliness. He can see nothing in front of him but dry, empty, dusty nothingness from now and forevermore, and it fills him with misery. Suddenly, this change comes over Plynlimmon. He feels like a snake is wrapping itself around his throat. He feels the air the breath being sucked in and out of his chest. He feels his shoulders heaving up and down, and then his heart, it begins to beat. It beats and it beats and it beats and it beats and it swells 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 and it swells, and then it just splits in two. Out of his eyes pour teardrops, 3 teardrops, and they trickle down his face and they fall into his hands. They are beautiful. They are the most beautiful things he has ever seen in all his days. But no sooner do they land in his hands than they trickle down between his fingers. They trickle down onto the dry, dusty desert floor, and they're gone. No, he shouts. He falls down onto his knees. Please, he shouts, come back, come back. And then a miracle happens. Up out of those muddy, dusty puddles come 3 things, and they're laughing, and they're singing, and they're dancing, and they're twisting around him, around his arms, around his legs. What are you? He shouts. You should know that, Plynlimon. I am Ystwyth, I am Hafren, and I am why we are your daughters, born of your tears. We are your daughters, born of your heart.
Of your heart. We are your daughters, born of your tears. We are your daughters, born of your heart.
And they were his daughters. They were the 3 most beautiful, strong, powerful, wise, funny daughters that any man has ever known. And a magical thing happened, because wherever those daughters went, they seemed to leave life behind them. That dry, dusty desert, it began to turn into a wilderness, great clumps of grass springing up everywhere. And in that grass, suddenly there were bugs, and little nests began to emerge in this grass. And as the months and years went by, that dry, dusty, endless desert got transformed into a green desert, a green, lush desert full of life, the sky full of birdsong. And as the years went by and his daughters grew, they grew and they grew into beautiful, beautiful young women, strong and brilliant in every way. Now, even though those daughters had been born at exactly the same moment, from exactly the same heart, they were different, so different. The youngest, that's me, said Ystwyth, telling the story to Brigid. The youngest was Ystwyth, and she was wild and adventurous, so adventurous. She was always getting up into mischief. And she heard this story one day from a bird, and it told her that down on the other side of the mountain there was a great ocean, and this ocean, it connected people across the wide world, and that across that wide world there were people with different cultures and amazing different places, and oh, how she longed to know more about it. She went to her father. Father, I heard a bird and it told me that across the ocean there are other people and cultures and wonderful things. Tell me about it. But her father, who'd lived his whole life on that mountain, he just couldn't answer her. The middle daughter was Hafren. Now, Hafren was tall, and she was wise, and she was very precise about everything, and she was a worker, a real worker. And she heard rumours that across the land there were people, and these people could tell stories, and they could draw beautiful pictures, and they could sing beautiful songs. And she heard that these people, more than anything, they needed water, they needed her. Oh, how she longed to go and see them. She asked her father about him, but as he had lived his whole life on that mountain, he just could tell her nothing. Now, the eldest daughter, she was Why. Now, Why was as wild as the mountain that she'd been born on. She loved it there. She didn't care what was across the land. She didn't care what was across the ocean. She just wanted to live there with her father forever. She held her father in her arms. Father, me and you and my sisters, we're going to live on this mountain forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And nothing is going to change. And it's going to be wonderful forever and ever and ever. And that was when her father realised these daughters were grown. Nothing can stay the same forever. Everything must die. Everything must change. It was time for those 3 daughters to go on their own journeys, to have their own adventures. If he could just give them one last gift, one last thing that would help them off that mountain. Tears, he thought. Tears. If I can give them 3 more tears, then that'll give them the power that they need. And so he tried to remember that feeling from that very first day. He tightened up his throat as hard as he could. He tensed up his body. He tried to shake with all his might. He tried to make his shoulders heave up and down. He tried to breathe really fast. He squeezed and 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 he squeezed, but it was no good. He was just too happy. And then he had an idea. He looked down, and there on the ground, you could see the 3 remnants of those muddy puddles. In his shirt was that needle, that enchanted needle. It was rusty now. Very carefully, he gathered up the remnants of those last teardrops. He held them carefully in his arms. He took that needle, rubbed off the rust, and he worked. He worked by the light of the sun. He worked by the light of the moon. He worked and he worked and he worked, and at the end of the 3rd night, he looked down and he marvelled at his creations. 3 beautiful cloaks, one red, one green, one blue, one for each of his beautiful daughters. And as the sun came up that next morning, it was different. Change was coming. He called his daughters to him. Daughters, first was the turn of Ystwyth. Ystwyth would have the red cloak. Adventurous Ystwyth. So he wrapped this cloak around her. He tied it carefully underneath her chin. And he wrapped her in his arms. And immediately she felt the power of this cloak wrapping itself around her. And she leaped up into the air with a great shriek. She leaped up into the air and she went tumbling down that mountain as fast as she could. She had to get to the ocean. Down past crags, through heather, past bracken, and out into the ocean. And that is the time where she about them. So the next was 7.
Sorry, Kama, we lost about 2 sentences because the froze. So if you wouldn't mind repeating those.
I'd love to go back. Where did we get to?
The perfect time. It froze at the perfect time. It said, and that was the moment when.
She met Brigid.
That was the moment that she met Brigid. Brilliant. And of course, Ystwyth, she wouldn't be able to tell you about the other 2. So I'm going to take the responsibility because I feel like you must know what happened to Havren and to why. So the next daughter, Havren, she was the tall one, the precise one, the one that wanted to help people to know about cultures and arts and stories and songs. Her father wrapped the blue cloak around her. He held her in his arms, and immediately she too felt the power of that cloak. And she went pouring down out of his arms, down that mountain and out into England. And sure enough, there were people, so many people, and the people loved her, they adored her. Before long, villages and towns grew up on her banks, and boats began to sail down her. And do you know what? She became the longest, straightest, strongest river in all of the land. Next was the turn of Why. Wild, wild, why. Her father wrapped the green cloak around her and she didn't want to go. She held onto her father so tight. Father, please, I do not want to go. But the power of that cloak, it was so strong. She couldn't resist it. And she felt it pulling her away from her father and down that hill and round the mountain. And when she got round the mountain, she had never seen anything so beautiful in all of her days. It was so beautiful, in fact, that she didn't even want to move forward. She twisted this way and that, hardly even wanting to move forward. And this magical thing happened because as she came down, all the little tributaries, it was like they could sense her and they came tumbling down the mountain towards her and they burst onto the back of her cloak and they were just rabbiting 1,000 stories about the land and the places, ancient stories of the land. And so they travelled together with all these stories down through Wales and out into the big, wide ocean. Now, this ocean was huge, it was enormous, it was frightening. But why? She didn't stay there long. Suddenly she felt this change coming over her. She began to drift up high, high, higher, 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 higher. She had transformed into a cloud. And then all of a sudden a great wind, it picked her up. I'm taking you home, said the wind. And it carried her back across Wales. And she looked down from up here, she could see Wales from a completely different angle. And it was more beautiful than anything she had seen. And sure enough, that wind, it took her back to her father. And like all clouds do, she transformed into raindrops and she dropped softly onto her father's back. And she told him stories and stories and stories of all the tributaries, all the places that she had seen. And before long, of course, Severn came back and Ystwyth came back in the way that rivers always do, come back to their source. And they'd told stories and they'd go on their journeys and they'd come back and they'd tell stories and go on their journeys. But you know, every time they returned to that mountain, they were stronger and braver and bolder and wiser than the last time he had seen them.
Dear river, why you keep rolling along, not knowing where you're going or where you come from. Your head's in the valley and your tail's in the sea. Dear river, why stay a while and listen to me. Dear river, why sail me down to the sea, where seagulls sing anthems and circle round free, and there let me lie where the waters descend. Dear river, why for the ride I must confide that you are my friend.
And I wonder what Brigid would have thought of this story as it carried her up into Wales. And sure enough, she did spread her kindness through Wales. And there are hundreds of churches across the land that are honouring her. So thank you, Ireland, for lending her to us. I believe she then went back to you and did lots of wonderful things for you too. But thank you.
I think we share her, Kama. You know, like many stories across the Celtic tradition, we share them. They went back and forth across the seas with our people looking for work, you know, and got changed and transformed. And, you know, they often say you can tell a story to 30 beating hearts and 30 versions of that story will go forth. And you can hear so many little threads coming through these stories that are similar, you know, and you can hear the ownership of the clans of old saying, "These are ours," you know. So yeah, that was absolutely stunning, Kama. I absolutely loved that. Jim, I was just wondering, do you have 2 or 3 lines of a Welsh song? We'd love to hear the Welsh language.
I'm a Welsh learner. I speak very, very bad Welsh. I can sing it. Heno, heno, hen blan bach. Heno, heno, hen blan bach. Dimma, 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 hen blan bach. Dimma, 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 hen blan bach. I'm very much at the lullaby stage. Nursery rhymes.
That will do. That was beautiful. That will do. How nurturing and nourishing for St. Bridget's Day to be lulled with a lullaby, you know. So thank you very much. I'm now going to release you from the spotlight, and I'm going to tell Shona to shore up and get ready. But just before Shona comes on, we'll go back to the silver linings of the COVID cloud, and loads of people there saying how the music swayed them and how beautiful it was to see all the people swaying slowly in time in the little square boxes on our Zoom screens. And I have to agree, it was absolutely magic. So thank you for that, COVID silver lining. Keep them coming. The silver lining of the COVID clouds, they need to keep coming, because all change bears hidden gold, and we're finding some of it tonight. And now we're going to carry on with the red thread of story, and I'm going to reintroduce the fabulous Shona from Scotland. So Shona, can you unmute? Because I think you're still, there you are. So Shona, would you like to tell us your second story?
Arise, arise, the sun is but a glimmer. Can you hear us calling the break of the day? For the long months of the winter, they now are behind us. We fall behind Brigid, the one that we adore. Brigid was walking across Scotland, and with each step, new shoots were sprouting around her. She brought nature as she moved. And then she came across a butterfly who was a sad-looking gal. She said, "What ails you, butterfly? What's on your mind?" And the butterfly was shocked to see Brigid. She said, "Oh, Brigid, what are you doing here? Oh, hi." "The thing is, Brigid," says the butterfly, "I've just got this feeling that there's more in this world than I can see in this small place." And Brigid says, "Well, you've got wings, girl, and they're beautiful. Fly." And so she did. She set off and she was flying, and she thinks, what am I actually looking for? What am I looking for? I'll find it, I guess, when I see it. And she flies across the sky, and she flies across the valleys of Scotland, and she sees the beautiful hills below her, and she flies and she flies and she flies until she catches the eye of a hawk, who sees her, makes a beeline, who zooms up behind her, and then realizes she's beautiful. Not something to eat, something to cherish. And the hawk says to the butterfly, "Butterfly, you are beautiful. Will you marry me?" And the butterfly says, "Well, I didn't see you there, hawk. You came up very fast behind me. Thank you. And no, you're not the one for me." And the butterfly flies on away from the hawk, and she flies until it's dinner time. And she lands on the branch of a tree, and she sups from the nectar of the flower. And the tree looks at the butterfly and says, "Butterfly, butterfly, you've been sent from Brigid. You're so beautiful. Will you marry me? And the butterfly says, thank you, tree. You are sweet. You are, but no, you're not the one for me. And she flies off and she carries on until the sun sets and the moon rises and the moonbeam lights up the butterfly as she flies across the sky. And the moon says, what a girl! What wings you've got! You're so beautiful. Butterfly, I am the moon and I will shine on you. Will you marry me? And the butterfly thinks, well, you are bright and I think you're really great, but no, you're not the one for me. And she carries on through the night, and over the night she sees the long sea over to Ireland, and the stars shout out to her, go to Ireland, you're gonna love it. And she thinks, I do love it. Okay, so she goes across the sea and she arrives in Ireland where it's green and beautiful. And she follows a stream into the country, a tiny little babbling brook from the coast right until the centre of the country, where she lands. And she waits. And across the river, she sees another butterfly. And she knows that's the one for me. She flies over and she asks them, I think you're the one for me. Will you marry me? And of course the butterfly says yes, and of course they get married that very night, and Brigid comes and they gather all the fruit and the nectar and the animals and the insects. They feast and they have a huge wedding. And at one point, our butterfly says to her groom, my darling, I love you. You are the one for me. Will you get me a drink of water? And so the groom butterfly takes a buttercup and says, of course, my love, anything for you, and flies to the waterside. And he bends over into the river and he scoops up a little bit of water, at which point a fish comes and eats the groom. And the wedding table falls silent. And a bit of nectar falls out of one of the bees' mouths. And Bride, she drops her head. And our butterfly, our girl, she goes to the riverside. And she starts to look for the fish that ate her love. And a frog sees her plight and he decides to join in. And he jumps from lily pad to lily pad and lily pad to lily pad. And then the birds, they join in and they swoop down and up looking for the fish that ate the groom. And then the moon, he sees what's going on and he shines his light down on the scene. And the insects, they join in too and they swirl around and around, and soon the butterfly is spinning and the frogs are jumping and the insects are twirling and the birds are swooping and the moon is shining and the butterfly is crying with grief and loss. And so the fish, he raises his head from the bottom of the river and he sees the scene above him and it's fucking magnificent. And his mouth opens with incredulity and awe at this sight of grief and magic and dancing wide until, of course, the butterfly flies free and they go back to the wedding feast and Brady blesses them both and they move on into the summer.
Oh my goodness, that was just beautiful. And it was a visual feast as well. Could everybody see all the dancing and it was like a dance on my screen. It was just beautiful, Shona. I really loved that, you know. And when we were thinking about Brigid and Bride and nourishment and nurture and spring, we thought about stories of transformation and stories of new growth. And wow, did that fit our little box. That was absolutely beautiful. Thank you so much, Shona. So that was Shona's second story of the evening. Now we're coming up to the penultimate. So I'm going to release Shona from the spotlight for a second. And I'm going to say, before we call on Claire Fennell, we want to say our thanks and express our gratitude. We thank whatever gods brought us together, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, and we feel that this triskel of energies is very oldly twined, and we feel very privileged to be part of this. We feel really privileged to be supported in that by the Carrad Museum in Wales and by Kerry Writers Museum, under whose cyber roof we all meet tonight. They've been just so good, and we see a great marriage between museums who are keeping a thumbprint of history and storytelling, and how they hold the truths of the generations. So those are our first thanks, but there would be no storytelling sessions. There would be no sessions without you. 72 souls are here tonight, all gathered around this cyber fire on St. Brigid's Day. Thank you so much. Thank you for your support and for coming along today. Thank you to all of the artists, to Davóg Rynne, who put together a beautiful intro, break and extra for us, to Nuala Hayes, who's just so supportive, as are the people of the Storytellers of Ireland, to Jim, who we met for the first time tonight, and to all of the background people. And now, as part of the COVID silver lining cloud, I want you to imagine, to use our inner eye and to imagine that we're in this big room, this big log cabin called Kerry Writers Museum. It has a wooden floor. It has these soundproof walls so that we can make as much noise as we want. It has a high roof. The temperature is comforting and warm. And we get to make an Irish casa where you put a right hand up and a left hand down, and you shuffle in until you have your arms around one another. Come now to the screen and let's give a virtual hug to one another. Put your right hand up and your left hand down, and let's make this hug happen. Oh, that's beautiful. Mwah! Thank you very much. So the formal part of our night is going to finish very shortly. It's going to finish on a song with our wonderful Claire Fennell, after which I won't talk anymore. I'll just play Davóg's music. We'll have a 10-minute comfort break and we'll come back to the holy and a half. So come back if you want to hear who brings songs that walks in the door. This is the troubadour part of the night, and we have some fantastic guests for you. So without further ado, I'm going to say, Claire, make yourself known. I'm going to spotlight you up. There's our lovely Claire, and you can sing us 2 songs if you like.
I do anyway.
I'm going to sign off now as Vanity of Part 1.
No problem. Thanks, Maria. For the second song this evening, I'm going to sing A Sweetless Stole. It is one from John B. Keane himself. Oh, sweetless stole, I've loved you all my days. Your towering spires and shining streets and squares, where sings the field its everlasting lays, and whispers to you in its evening prayers. Of all fair towns, none has so sweet a soul, nor gentle folk, compassionate and true. Where'er I go, I love you, sweetless soul, and doff my distant cap each day to you. Down by the field, the willows dip their wands, by magic bowers where soft the night wind sighs. How oft I've roved along your moonlit lands, where late love blew blooms and first love never dies. Of all fair towns, none has so sweet a soul, nor gentle folk, compassionate and true. Where'er I go, I love you, sweetless soul, and doff my distant cap each day to you. And so, dear friends, I bid farewell to you, as fate ordains for me a far-off roll. Dear friends and neighbors, here's my fond adieu, until we meet once more in sweet Listowel. Of all fair towns, none has so sweet a soul, nor gentle folk, compassionate and true. Where'er I go, I love you, sweet Listowel, and doff my distant cap each day to you. And doff my distant cap each day to you.
Oh my goodness, that was absolutely beautiful. I think we need another one. I think we do.
Oh,
am I putting you on the spot?
You're putting me on the spot. I don't know.
Well, I tell you what. So I call for you in the second half. I call for you in the second half. So I'm going to release you then from the spotlight. Remove spotlight. There we go.
Thanks.
And I'm just going to spotlight myself there again for a second. Last COVID silver lining. I just got it on my phone. So one of our beautiful tellers saying you didn't see it in the chat. I sent you a private chat. So please read this Brigid blessing. So here's a Brigid blessing, an Irish traditional Brigid blessing. May Brigid bless the house wherein you dwell. Bless every fireside, every wall and every door. May she bless every heart that beats beneath its roof. Bless every hand that toils to bring it joy. Bless every foot that walks its portals through. May Brigid bless the house that shelters you. May Brigid bless the house that shelters you.
The circle and the flame for Imbolc. Wolf moon rises, broken promises are healed, and the feast begins, as they say, in the belly. The wintry light is pregnant with summer's milk, and flowers ooze other waken light, and all the white's delight. Tribe and land, language and rocks meet in the circle of this flame. The bones of earth, elemental nooks of all the circle's measure, hold the ancient tribes in bondage to the laws of fealty. Knowledge of this old way begins in words born of valour, deeds of ancient warriors dying for the people of the land. Remembrance of this light, the women show their thought, sewing banners to the woolen cloth, with twisted threads of memory to hold the thoughts of poets strong. Spider, asp and wasp, thistle, gorse and nettle, all the children of the goddess's lands, keepers of its mysteries. Niall of the 9 hostages knows this truth. The old crone cast her eye upon him, and he recognized the green spark of goddess's tears. The centre holds the bilious, the world tree. Golden leaves waving above gathers the tribes into this inner circle. And so, in the dead month under the wolf moon, we celebrate in feasting, when ravens nest and larks sing and rain brings lamb to birth. For then the old woman of the year, Cealach, rises with her white wand, a bride of spring, breathing power into the winter king, releasing him from his dour sleep of harsh snow, while serpent lords scatter to the four winds of time, knowing their time is at an end. And then the exalted one, Brigid, golden hair, encircled by children, comes among her people to celebrate the Feast of Imbolc.